Alexander of Macedon was 32 when he died in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was a man who had stormed the known world from the Greek city-states to the deserts and palaces of Persia, and returned, for the final time, to a bed of fever and silence. The story most of us learned in school is terse and terrible. The great conqueror fell ill after a banquet. His strength ebbed, and on the 11th day he breathed his last. But the more historians, physicians, and curious minds have probed that final week, the fog of certainty has only deepened. Some modern scholars now ask a question that is at once medical and morally chilling. Was Alexander truly dead when those around him declared it? Or was he instead paralyzed, fully conscious in his mind, but unable to move, call out, or even signal that he remained alive? To understand why this question arises, we must re-examine the peculiarities written down by ancient chroniclers. Those who recorded Alexander's decline accounts, compiled years and decades later, filtered through rumor, admiration, and myth, agree on certain odd details. He suffered high fever, severe abdominal pain, progressive weakness, and eventually lost the power of speech. Afterwards, accounts insist, his body remained uncorrupted for several days. Not the immediate decay one might expect after death in a hot Babylonian summer. Those two facts, together the loss of voluntary movement and a delayed appearance of decomposition, are the curious clues that invite a modern diagnosis. In 2018, Dr. Catherine Hall, a classicist and lecturer with training in medical reasoning, published a careful case study proposing a striking solution. Alexander may have suffered an acute form of Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS. GBS is not a single disease, but a family of autoimmune neuropathies in which the body's immune system attacks peripheral nerves. In some variants, a person's muscles weaken progressively until total paralysis, including the muscles that move the limbs, eyes, and even the diaphragm that drives breathing. Critically, many forms of GBS leave cognitive function intact. The mind is awake and aware, even as the body is rendered inert. Hall argued that the pattern of Alexander's signs of febrile illness, followed by flaccid paralysis and respiratory decline, together with a symbolic freshness of the corpse for days, fits a GBS scenario better than several competing theories. It is easy to picture the scene that Hall and other writers evoke. Alexander, a brilliant mind trapped inside a motionless shell, able perhaps to see, to hear, and to think, but unable to gesture, to speak, or to breathe on his own when the diaphragm failed. In the ancient world, the clinical tools for determining death were rudimentary. Physicians looked for breath, for movement, and for warmth. They often relied on bystanders to judge whether a man was gone. A person in profound paralysis, with faint or absent visible respiration, could easily have been mistaken for dead. Surgeons today will tell you that a stopped chest, or what looks stopped, can be the last act of life, and that without careful monitoring, the difference between no apparent breath and no life can be fatal. In short, the mechanics of misdiagnosis are tragically plausible. But the claim that Alexander might have been coerced into a grave while still sentient rests on several linked inferences, and each step has critics. First, GBS is not the only condition consistent with fever, weakness, and loss of speech. Ancient sources mention severe abdominal pain, sweats, and fevers that match infectious syndromes, typhoid fever, malaria, or other systemic infections have long been offered as alternatives. Infectious causes can also, on occasion, trigger neurological complications, including flaccid paralysis. Second, the famed delayed decomposition that looms so large in retellings has ambiguous support in the sources. Ancient writers differ in how long they reported the body remaining fresh, and some of that reporting may be rhetorical, a way of placing the hero beyond ordinary human bounds. Third, retro-diagnosing historical figures is inherently speculative. Descriptions are second-hand. The vocabulary of symptoms is imprecise, and modern disease categories do not always map neatly onto ancient language. For these reasons, mainstream scholars treat the GBS idea as an intriguing, but not definitive hypothesis. Let us pull the threads of evidence a little tighter. Guillain-Barré syndrome often follows an infection commonly, in modern epidemiology, after Campylobacter jejuni, a bacterium associated with contaminated food and water. Hall suggested that Alexander, exposed to the unsanitary conditions of marching armies and wounded from prior campaigns, could plausibly have contracted such an infection. In the typical modern course, GBS progresses over days to weeks. Weakness grows, reflexes vanish, and respiratory muscles may fail. If Alexander experienced this cascade, then by the final days he could have been fully paralyzed, yet mentally alert, an image that chills the imagination. Some proponents also point to Alexander's earlier wounds, a likely weakened immune state, and his heavy drinking as predisposing factors that might explain why an otherwise rare autoimmune attack could be devastating. Yet the plausibility of patient awareness does not settle the matter of death. A key physiological question is this: if Alexander's diaphragm became progressively weakened, would he not have succumbed to respiratory failure before being declared dead? In modern ICUs, a paralyzed patient with failing respiration will show clear distress unless mechanically ventilated. Ancient Babylon had no mechanical ventilators. The best physicians could do was attempt assisted breathing massages, smelling salts, rushing air into the mouth measures that are unreliable. Some scholars argue that the final visible cessation of breath described by the sources likely marked true biological death. Without ventilatory support, diaphragmatic paralysis is typically fatal. Others counter that shallow, intermittent breaths can be missed, particularly if the patient's chest was rigid or hidden under coverings, or if onlookers wanted the myth of a divine death to persist. The historical record cannot resolve these fine physiologic distinctions. There are other patterns in the sources that support both caution and curiosity. Plutarch, Justin, and Arrian, among the best narrative sources for Alexander, record that his speech failed and his mobility collapsed, but the details vary. Some emphasize a slow wasting that looks infectious. Others depict sudden collapses that fit poisoning scenarios. Ancient reports that the bier and the body were honored for several days without decay are perhaps the most sensational piece of evidence for the buried alive narrative. Yet, decomposition depends on temperature, burial practices, embalming attempts, and the precise interval between death and exposure. A body that appears fresh for a few days is not in itself proof of life. Modern forensic knowledge tells us that appearances are treacherous in interpreting post-mortem change, and ancient observers had no standardized checklist for rigor mortis, livor mortis, or body temperature. So why does the GBS theory attract so much attention? Partly because it is a rare moment where medical reasoning seems to knit together with narrative touchstones. The single man of immense will, struck down by a body that no longer obeys him, apparently conscious while his followers grieved him as dead. It makes for a tragic, almost literary, ending, one that resonates with modern anxieties about paralysis, locked-in syndromes, and the ethics of end-of-life diagnosis. And medically, GBS is a disease we can test today. Its clinical pattern ascending weakness, areflexia, respiratory compromise after an antecedent infection, maps well to the skeleton of Alexander's reported symptoms. That match, however elegant, is still a match between patterns, not the discovery of a smoking gun. Beyond the medical and narrative, there are political and ritual dimensions to consider. Alexander's death precipitated a power vacuum that shattered his empire into fighting fragments. Ancient and medieval writers had plenty of motive to interpret his end as miraculous, meaningful, or conspiratorial. Accusations of poisoning by rivals, by the court, or by agents of destiny proliferated because they served political narratives. The idea that Alexander might have been buried alive also feeds into post-classical horror. The image of a great king entombed while aware conveniently creates a moral about hubris and the limits of mortal control. Historians must therefore separate what the evidence likely shows from what the story wants it to show. What then is the responsible conclusion for a voiceover that wants both drama and accuracy? We can say this: Guillain-Barré syndrome is a plausible medical explanation for a constellation of Alexander's symptoms, especially the progressive paralysis with preserved mental faculties, and it helps explain why ancient observers might have misread a paralyzed man as dead. But plausibility is not proof. Other diseases remain credible: typhoid fever, malaria, other systemic infections, and various natural and accidental causes. The sources themselves are distant and contradictory. Some details may be literary embellishment. No bone, no tissue, no contemporaneous clinical diary from Babylon survives to be analyzed with modern methods. Absent new physical evidence, each diagnosis remains an informed hypothesis rather than an established fact. There is finally a human lesson in this speculation. The temptation to retrofit modern categories onto ancient lives is strong, because those categories give us control. They make sense of chaos. They translate a myth into physiology, a fable into a case study. But history resists finality. Alexander's last days were observed by people who loved him, feared him, envied and mythologized him. They wrote down what they could through lenses of culture and agenda. When modern medicine reads those texts, it does not merely decode symptoms, it illuminates how changing vocabularies of disease and death shape our stories about the past. Whether Alexander was truly dead when his attendants pronounced him gone, or whether he lingered conscious for a brief and terrible interval, the question forces us to reckon with the limits of knowledge and the deep poignancy of human vulnerability. If you plan to use this voiceover for a video, you can end with a reflective coda. Alexander's life rewired the ancient world. His death rewired the imagination. Perhaps the most fitting memorial is not an answer, but the question itself, a reminder that the boundary between life and death has always been, and will always be, a place of stories. And in that borderland, science, history, and empathy meet. Not to deliver final judgment, but to keep asking, with humility and rigor, what it means to be alive.